Good. Thanks for making it tonight. We know the weather's terrible, and we really appreciate the effort in getting here. Welcome to the second lecture in the South End Press 25th Anniversary Lecture Series. Last week, we were really happy to have Noam Chomsky speak here on Monday to a similarly packed house. And I want to tell you a little bit about South End Press before we get started. We've been passing out catalogs, so you might have a sense of who we are and what we publish. We're a homegrown institution, and we've been in the Boston area since 1977, first in the South End and now down the street in Central Square. And you can take a look at our catalog and see that we publish a really good collection of progressives, muckrakers, hellraisers of multiple stripes. And tonight we're very happy to welcome another local progressive to the stage, the activist and historian Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn is Professor Emeritus of History at Boston University. He's the author of the book People's History of the United States, as well as the South End Press titles Marx and Soho and the forthcoming book Emma on Emma Goldman. He's a tireless activist. If you've attended a teach-in, demonstration, or lecture about the war in the last few months, you may have been able to hear his humane and wise perspectives on the war. His forthcoming book, Terrorism and War, interviews with South End Press editor Anthony Arno, that's coming out, it's out this week actually. There's some really choice quotes and it's a wonderful collection of interviews. This is from the book. We have a long tradition in this country of stifling dissent exactly at those moments when dissent is badly needed. Exactly when you need free speech, when the lives of the young people in the armed forces, the lives of people overseas, who may be the victims of our armed actions, are at stake, that's when you should shut up, exactly when you need it most. So you have free speech for trivial issues and not for life and death issues, and that's called democracy. No, we can't accept that. And I'd like to bring Howard Zinn to the stage to talk a little bit more about what he's been talking about.
Thank you, Jill. Is this all right? Yes. A little louder. There's always malcontents in the audience. How's this? Better. But not really good. Let's see. How's this? Okay. Well, you've just heard about South End Press. Maybe you already know about South End Press. Maybe that's why you're here, because you know about South End Press. But I need to say something about South End Press, or they won't let me go on with my speech. That South End Press has been around for 25 years, which is amazing. Not only has it been around for 25 years, but it has grown and increased its production and increased its readership, and it's amazing. Hardly anybody gave it a chance to survive, especially in a time when, as you know, the great monopoly publishers have been swallowing up all the little independent publishers. But South End Press has stuck it out and has been producing some really remarkable books. So I hope you'll buy its books. You don't have to read them. Just buy them. And they're going to have books, right? They're going to be books out back, right? You won't be able to get out of the church without passing very aggressive South End salespeople. So just one announcement to make, and that is Jill Stein is running for governor. Do you know that? Yeah. Some of you don't know that, I can tell. And Jill Stein is the Green Party candidate for governor. And she's the one person running for governor who has something really important to say and who is going to bring issues into this campaign which nobody else is bringing into the campaign. She's a wonderful candidate. She deserves our support. I think there are people hovering around somewhere who will take your names if you want to volunteer to help her in the coming campaign. It would be a very worthwhile thing to do. Okay. So now, I guess I will talk about the war. What else is there to talk about, right? They don't even allow us to talk about anything else. In fact, they don't know what we're going to say, but they really don't want us to talk about anything else. We may as well comply with that so long as we say the things we want to say and not the things they want us to say. So, what do I want to say about the war on terrorism? First, that I don't think it's a war on terrorism. You may as well challenge the concept right from the start. I don't think it's a war on terrorism. And if you listened to President Bush's State of the Union address, if you had the nerve to listen to Bush's State of the Union address, which I had to do for professional reasons, and there's a lot of things I listen to which I hate to listen to, but I do it for professional reasons. But if you listen to Bush's State of the Union address and listen to it carefully, you would, I think, come to the conclusion that this is not really a war on terrorism. He starts off saying, we are winning the war on terrorism. Okay. Then a few paragraphs later he says, I happen to have his exact words, which are priceless. Tens of thousands of terrorists are still at large. Terror training camps still exist in at least a dozen countries. Well, if that's so, how can we be winning the war on terrorism? I mean, it would be a very, very, very long war. And the Boston Globe, just a few weeks ago, said, 4 months into the campaign in Afghanistan, U.S. officials acknowledged that American forces have killed or captured only one senior al-Qaeda figure and 7 far less prominent leaders. 4 months into the Afghan campaign, one senior al-Qaeda leader. And there are tens of thousands of trained terrorists around. The mathematics of that suggests an endless war. And it also suggests that there must be something else going on besides the idea of doing something about terrorism, because here we have been bombing Afghanistan for 4 months, and there's really no indication that the threat of terrorism has declined. I mean, you can ask yourself a question, right? We've been bombing Afghanistan for 4 months. Do we feel more secure now than we did 4 months ago? Is the country less nervous now than it was 4 months ago? If anything, people are more nervous. People are more worried. They're coming out with new forms of alert: yellow, red, green, purple, you know. And every other day they're warning us, well, something may happen tomorrow. something is wrong here. We're certainly not accomplishing anything against terrorism. In fact, it doesn't take much thought to understand that the very nature of terrorism suggests that you can't get rid of terrorism by bombing. Terrorism is not a specific country which you can bomb into submission. Well, as the administration itself says, there are a dozen countries, or sometimes they've given us 15 countries, or sometimes they've said there are 20 or 30 countries which may harbor terrorists. So you can't make war on a country, pick out the poorest, most miserable, most war-torn, most bombed-out country in the world and bomb it, and then that's going to get rid of terrorism. No, they must know that the aim is not terrorism. It's just the nature of terrorism doesn't call for a military action to do something about it. And of course, we have the historical evidence of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I mean, it could hardly be clearer that force doesn't do the trick. You have Palestinian car bombers, yes, terrorists, and they blow people up, including themselves. And then the Israelis react with overwhelming military force, because force, of course, will do it, right? And then the next day there's another car bombing, and then there's more Israeli force, and then another car bombing, more Israeli tanks and guns and invasion of refugee camps and so on, and it goes on and on. I mean, the history of that is so obvious. And the history of other incidents of terrorism in the world. You know, did British power brought in against IRA terrorism stop the IRA from continuing to commit terrorist acts? No, it went on and on and on for decades. It should be very clear that this bombing is not going to accomplish anything to end terrorism. And if it's not, then why are we dropping bombs? Why are we killing people? Why have we killed, and we don't know exactly how many, certainly at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 civilians killed in the bombing. You know, the professor at the University of New Hampshire did a very detailed survey of the press, not using Mid-Eastern press dispatches, using Western press dispatches, using the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times, which have had over the months scattered references to civilian casualties, or reading what most Americans will not see, and that is dispatches sent out by the Reuters news agency in England, or by Agence France Presse, by the London Independent, by the Guardian of London, putting all of that together, and he comes up with a figure of over 4,000 civilian casualties. And so, on the one hand, we are not accomplishing anything about terrorism. On the other hand, we're killing a lot of innocent people. That is morally unacceptable. And that's something that the American people should think about, should know about, and something we should spread the word about and get people to think about it. Because I believe that when people begin to put information together which has been withheld from them, and you know, the government and the press in collaboration have studiously worked to keep the information on civilian casualties from the American public. You probably know network executives have sent the word out, don't play up civilian casualties. And of course, the Pentagon itself, in the daily briefings that you see on television, and television is just swamped with the briefings of the Pentagon. They're not swamped with dissenting voices. You don't hear dissenting voices on national television, but you hear the Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, again and again and again, and the generals and the Pentagon spokespeople again and again. And if some reporter should, and this doesn't happen too often, should ask them a question about civilian casualties in Afghanistan, they will say, well, we're not sure about that. Things happen. There is such a thing as collateral damage, right? And you may recall that Timothy McVeigh, when asked about the children who died in the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, when Timothy McVeigh was asked, what about those kids who died as a result of the bombing of the federal building? And Timothy McVeigh said, having learned the phrase as a soldier in the Gulf War, when that phrase was used, Timothy McVeigh shrugged his shoulders and said, collateral damage. And then they will say, we didn't intend to kill civilians. It was an accident. They kept talking about, unintended consequences. Well, they put civilians in the way. Reminding me of the time during the Gulf War. Some of you may remember this, but a very grisly incident back in 1991 in the middle of February in the Gulf War when the United States bombed an air raid shelter in Baghdad. An air raid shelter bombed, and 400 to 500 men, women, children were killed, incinerated in that air raid shelter. And the expectation was that the U.S. government would say it was a mistake, as they so often do. Computer error, bad intelligence. Have we ever had good intelligence? But we thought, yes, we thought they'd said it was a mistake. But no, they didn't. They said it was a military target. The air raid shelter was a military target. They said it was a communications center. Western reporters going through the ruins of the air raid shelter the day after the bombing unanimously reported no sign of any communications equipment, no sign of anything military, and yet deliberately bombed. I say this to suggest that when they say we only bomb military targets or we only aim at military targets, the definition of military targets is a deliberately vague one to cover up all sorts of crimes. So you might say, well, maybe it's not intentional, but it's also not an accident. You can't have accident after accident after accident after accident while the human toll rises and then say, it's an accident. When you have so many accidents in a row, something else is going on. And I would say that if you can't say they are deliberately killing civilians, I think you can accurately say they are bombing this country with a reckless disregard for human life. Just in the way a driver racing a car down a crowded street with children at 80 miles an hour may not intend to kill children, but will inevitably. And that comes, if it's not deliberate, it comes close enough to deliberate not to deserve to be considered innocent and to deserve to be condemned as a crime. So, on the one hand, we are not doing anything about terrorism. On the other hand, we are engaging in terrorism in Afghanistan. And this is something that I believe that the American people began to think about and were given more information about and were asked questions about. I believe that the American people will begin to reject this, just as during the Vietnam War, when the American people began to get an idea of what we were doing in Vietnam. After listening to Pentagon propaganda, after listening to government statements about how we're fighting for liberty and democracy and self-determination in Vietnam, finally, and it took a couple of years, American people began to understand what we were doing to the people of Vietnam. They began to see the images for the first time of American Marines setting fire to the villages and huts in Vietnam. They began to see the pictures of the old people and women and children crowded around their burning huts. They began to see the pictures of the My Lai massacre, of the women huddled with their kids in the pit while American GIs poured automatic rifle fire into them. And when they began to see that, when those images began, when the American people began to get information, they turned against the war. And there's a dramatic change in American public opinion about the war, which suggests that, that the American people, like other people, are compassionate people, but when they are being fooled and when they're being led into believing that the government knows what it's doing, well, yes, they will accept what the authorities say until they find out different. Well, it's our job for them to find out different. It's our job to give them the information that has been withheld from them by the press and by the government. So if it's not a war on terrorism, what is it? And I suggest that what is going on is something that has been going on for a long time in American history, before this war on terrorism. And I suggest that you go back in history, not too far back, but go back to the period of the Cold War, when the key enemy was not terrorism, the key enemy was communism. And I would suggest that the Cold War was not really a war against communism. It's not that communism didn't exist, and it's not that communism wasn't a threat to, well, let's say, internally to the people in the Soviet Union and to some of the countries bordering the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. But there's a difference between recognizing the reality of a threat and expanding that reality into a kind of hysterical situation where everything that happens in the world is due to communism. And that becomes a convenience. The existence of communism in the world in the period of the Cold War became a convenience. It was useful. Because if you examine American foreign policy actions in the period of the Cold War, and ask yourself, how many of these actions had to do with communism? Well, you will find that there were many things that the United States was doing in the world, wars that the United States engaged in, military interventions that this government was engaged in, which really didn't have anything to do with communism. When the United States government overthrew the government of Iran in 1953, and put the Shah back on the throne. Always good to have a Shah. And when they did that, why did they do that? Communism wasn't in power in Iran when the United States decided to overthrow the government. A man named Mossadegh was in power, and Mossadegh did an unpardonable thing. He nationalized the oil fields in Iran. This cannot be tolerated by a government allied to oil corporations, which are accustomed to control oil and accustomed to governments that will play ball with them. And so that government had to go. But communism was not the issue. A year later, the government of Guatemala was overthrown by a covert United States CIA operation. Communism was not the issue. There was not a communist government in Guatemala. In fact, it was the second really democratically elected government in Guatemala. But it was overthrown. No, not because of communism, but because this president, who was somewhat left of center, well, that's bad in itself, but this president, who was somewhat left of center, but not a communist, had nationalized the land belonging to the United Fruit Company. You don't fool with United Fruit. And he even offered to pay United Fruit for it, which is hardly the sign of a revolutionary. A revolutionary would say, we're taking it back. No, offers to pay United Fruit. Well, offers to pay them the price that United fruit had set on the land for tax purposes. And so they considered that unfair. And so the United States overthrew the government of Arbenz in Guatemala. In Chile, in the early 1970s, the United States government conspired to overthrow the government of Allende. Allende was not a communist. He was a kind of socialist, but not a communist, not a tool of the Soviet Union or communist China. But what was the problem there? Because Allende was going to act against IT&T and against Anaconda Copper, and against the corporations that had been profiting in Chile, and that could not be tolerated. And so the IT&T officials, International Telephone and Telegraph officials, met with U.S. CIA officials, Henry Kissinger playing an important part in that operation, and engineered a coup in Chile, which then put into power the very brutal dictatorship of Pinochet. And it wasn't communism. And so my point is that, yes, there were situations where there were communist countries, as in, yes, there was a communist movement in Vietnam, although it was not a Soviet communist movement and not a Chinese communist movement, but it was a Vietnamese communist movement. And but there, too, the issue was not really communism. The issue was that somebody, whether they're communists or not, if they want to take over a country and make it independent of the United States, if they want to take over a country and not play ball with the United States, they've got to go. The common denominator for American foreign policy actions in the period of the Cold War was not opposition to communism. The common denominator was the necessity for the United States government to expand and control various parts of the world for the political and economic benefit of the power structure of the United States. And if you want some evidence for the fact that the issue during the Cold War was not communism, but the motive was American power, American expansion, all you have to do is think that, well, ask this question. What was the United States doing before 1917? That is, before the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, before there was a communist threat in the world. If American military intervention in the world was based on the existence of the Soviet Union and the Soviet threat, then before 1917, when there was no Soviet Union and no Soviet threat, presumably the United States was just a quiet power, minding its own business. But of course, the history of the United States does not indicate that at all. Long before 1917, the United States was expanding. It expanded with the Louisiana Purchase. It expanded with the Monroe Doctrine. It expanded into Indian territory, expanded into Mexican territory with the Mexican War. And then at the turn of the century, it expanded into Cuba and expanded into the Philippines and sent Marines into republics in Central America, into Guatemala and Honduras and the Dominican Republic, and occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic and bombarded Mexico, and all of this before 1917, before there was a Soviet Union. So I'm suggesting that there's a common denominator to American behavior in the world which goes beyond terrorism, goes beyond communism, and which has to do with something which very simple, imperialism. I don't like to use that word. It's such a nasty word. It's, it sounds like something bad. But after all, these are modern times. We are the most modern of nations. And what marks modern times is imperialism. What marks modern times is the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire and the French Empire and the German Empire and, of course, the British Empire, and then the last empire to come upon the scene and the most powerful of all, the American Empire. And I suggest that's what's at the root of what we're doing. And September 11th, which was a horrendous event, and which should make us stop and think about what to do about terrorism. But I would suggest that September 11th just became a handy excuse for the United States to expand even further in the world. Just as the blowing up of the battleship Maine in 1898 was a handy excuse for the United States to move into Cuba, move into the Philippines. Just as a little incident on the Texas-Mexico border in 1846 was an excuse for the United States to go into Mexico and take half of Mexico. Just as the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 was an excuse for the United States to begin a full-scale invasion of Vietnam. And so terrorism now, real as it is an excuse for what the United States government has been doing for a very, very long time, and that is expanding its power in the world to the detriment of huge numbers of people in the world and to the detriment of people here in the United States. Because one of the things that happens in a situation like this is by focusing the attention of the public on terrorism, the public doesn't have time or opportunity to think of anything else. The public is led to overlook whatever else is happening in the country because we must all be united behind the president to do something about terrorism. And so when that happens, the government then is able to do all sorts of things which are not to the benefit of the American people. And to use terrorism as an opportunity to curtail the civil liberties of Americans, to maintain more powerful control over the movements of Americans, over the communications of Americans, over the mass media. The war on terrorism becomes an opportunity also to siphon off more of the national wealth, more of the taxpayers' money into the military-industrial complex. The $400 billion now devoted to the military, a budget which is greater than the sum of all the military budgets of all possible enemies in the world. And in doing that, leaving less and less money for health care, for education, for children, for the needs of the American people. And so while the war on terrorism occupies center stage, the tax breaks for the rich are passed. If you read the newspapers the other day, doctors are cutting off patients from Medicare because the government has cut the payments to doctors for Medicare. And homelessness is increasing. And yes, here in this richest country in the world, the children are still going without food, and families are still going without housing, and 40 million people still going without health care, and we don't have the time to pay attention to that because we must concentrate on this spurious war on terrorism. And not only are we therefore not paying any attention to what is going on here at home, we also are not paying attention to what is going on abroad and what American policies are resulting in when it comes to people living in other countries in the world. Of course, primarily in these last 4 months, the people of Afghanistan, not just the thousands of civilian dead or whatever the number is, but the hundreds of thousands of Afghans who, as a result of our bombing, were forced to flee their homes and their villages and cross the border, swelling the number of people in refugee camps, terrorizing the people of Afghanistan, but not just the people of Afghanistan, but because of this concentration on what has happened in this country, September 11th, the awful, atrocious killing of 3,000 people, but because of the closing of a wall around that event, no attention being paid to what is happening to people in other countries of the world who are suffering in even much greater ways than we suffered, than people in this country suffered as a result of the bombing of the Twin Towers. 3,000 people died in one day in the bombing of the Twin Towers, a horrendous event. But that day, and the following day, and the following day, and every single day, 11,000 people die as a result in the world as a result of lack of food and lack of medical care. And when, after September 11th, there was one moment when the New York Times correspondent interviewed people in various third world countries about the bombing on September 11th and asked them for their reactions. And they all said, oh, it was a terrible thing. We sympathize with you. But worse things have happened to us by far. And you have not paid attention. You are grieving for these 3,000 people, and you should, But are you grieving for the millions of people in Africa who are dying of AIDS? Are you grieving for the millions of people who die every year around the world simply because of lack of medicine or lack of food? AIDS is killing all these millions of people in Africa, and the United States, spending $400 billion on its military budget, is spending a pittance to do something about AIDS in Africa. The World Health Organization says there's a silent genocide that is going on in the world. A genocide which is not the result of sort of deliberate machine gunning and bombing of people, but a genocide which is the result of the total neglect of people who are dying of sickness and dying of hunger when the resources exist in the world to do something about that, and those resources are being monopolized by a small elite in the world and are being diverted, in fact, to military weapons. So, yes, so the war on terrorism is being used to prevent us from looking at what is being done to us and to other people in the world. So it may be that what we are waging is not really a war on terrorists, but a war on us. That the enemy is not the terrorists, because they're elusive, they're everywhere, they cannot be found. The enemy is us. And if that is so, then it means we have to refigure our thinking about what is happening in this country and the world. And it means that while we need, I believe, to protest as powerfully as we can the fact that we are bombing other people in the world and killing people in a futile effort to do something about terrorism, while we must protest against that, we also at the same time, I think, must not be concentrating totally on that, must not be deflected from the fact that we need to ask the questions, what is happening to our civil liberties? What is happening to the great wealth of this country? Who is getting it and who is not getting it? And that would bring about a kind of, would complicate our attitude, complicate our actions, raise issues other than the war, and issues which I think the American people will understand even more clearly than they understand the difficult and complex issues of foreign policy. So I would, I guess, suggest that while we may very well have enemies here and there, terrorists here and there in the world, including here in this country, including in Washington, D.C., there are people, yes, who are threatening us, But it may be that the greatest enemies of the people of the United States and the greatest enemies of the people of the world are not in caves and complexes which can be bombed, but our greatest enemies are in sort of corporate boardrooms and government offices who are using the excuse of the war on terrorism to strengthen their hold on the wealth and the liberties of people in the world. So with that happy thought, I will stop. And you have an opportunity to ask questions, make impassioned statements, whatever. Thank you.
Any questions? Can people come down to the front? Down in the middle?
Yeah. Okay. Talking about the reaction there was to the 1977 legislation in El Salvador to shut people up, and why isn't there today in reaction to the Patriots Act sort of a similar, right, loud reaction? Well, the media are controlled in this country, and in a way that in the so-called pluralistic and democratic country is a more effective means of control than even in totalitarian countries where people know there's control and they use every possible opportunity to evade it and get around it. And because we have a political system in which the only party which is supposed to be, an opposition party is actually in cahoots with the ruling party, and so it's left to a small number of American people. It's left to alternative newspapers and alternative radio stations. It's left to the South End Press and Seven Stories Press. In other words, it's left to all of the dissident elements in American society on which we've always depended to begin to raise the issues. And when this happens, it grows. So I'm confident that the reaction to the Patriot Act and to the suppression of civil liberties that will grow in this country so long as we just persist.
Okay, can you keep your questions short?
Well, he's making 2 points. One, that there's something I didn't mention, which is very hard for me to believe. But I didn't mention, and it's a very important issue actually that you brought up, and which I said nothing about the whole question of UNICAL, about oil interests connected with Afghanistan, and all the shenanigans that have gone on between the Bush family and oil interests, and the connection between the Bush family and oil interests, and all of the dealings that were going on before September 11th about the possibilities of pipelines going through Afghanistan, bringing the oil from the Caspian Sea, farther west, to ports where it would be usable. Yes, I guess I should have said something about that. But I'm glad you brought it up, because now I can, and I will take credit for it. I have no doubt that, oil and the control of oil is a very important factor in our policy in the Middle East. Oil has been at the center of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East ever since World War II, ever since President Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud in 1945, right after the Yalta Conference, met with him in a warship in the Suez, and came to an agreement basically that the United States was going to take over from Great Britain in the Middle East as the protector of the kings and sheikhs of Saudi Arabia, and in return that the oil of Saudi Arabia would be available to American corporations. Ever since then, oil has been at the center of all American foreign policy in the Middle East, and it's true of Afghanistan too. Now, on your second point, and that is that in the case of Vietnam, there were GIs coming back, and there were bodies coming back, and there were amputees coming back from Vietnam, which had an important effect on American public opinion, whereas here, the United States, very conscious of what happened in the Vietnam years, the United States, very conscious of that, has tried to carry on wars where American casualties would be limited, and so as to really suppress the possibility of an anti-war movement. So I agree with you, it makes it harder. It makes it harder today to build a movement against the war. Harder, but not impossible. And so, you know, we are always dealing with difficulties. This is another one of them. But I also believe, you know, that while American casualties, of course, are very, very important in determining the state of American public opinion, I also believe that Americans have also been moved by what happens to people in other countries. That during the Vietnam War, while yes, it was the body bags of Americans coming home, which was very, very important, it was also the vision of what we were doing to peasants in Vietnam. And so, you know, it's important, even though our casualties are small, to think that you know, other people are suffering, and I think American people may respond to that too.
We're going to take 3 more questions.
No, actually, there have been rallies in Boston down at Copley Square with several thousand people.
Not since October.
Not since October?
No.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
Well, it's just a challenge.
Okay, right. What is the responsibility of people in the arts, of people, right, people in television, movies? Well, the responsibility is to do what you know, what the most enlightened and most committed thinkers in the arts have always done. You know, and whether they're actors or musicians, and that is that they not only did what the public expected them to do, sang and did theater and, you know, played music and did paintings, but they also spoke out. And there are people in the arts who are doing that. And, yeah, not enough. Oh, sure, sure.
Find a way to do it where it's entertaining.
Right. Well, yeah. And people like, I know, Ani DeFranco and people like Eddie Vedder trying to use the, you know, their, Bruce Springsteen, to people trying to, use their art to convey important things to people, as Dylan and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger did in the 60s. Yeah. Where should we look around the world for people who will raise the question of American war crimes and Americans appearing before international war crimes tribunals? Well, there are people in other countries in the world who are protesting against the war in even larger numbers than here in the United States. You know, there is a kind of network, and I think with all of the protests that took place from Seattle, to Porto Alegre, and all these protests have internationalized the movement against corporate power and against war, and I think it's likely to continue. Yes. How do I respond to somebody who says, well, we haven't won it in 4 months, but we're on our way to winning it? Well, there's no evidence that we're on our way to winning it. There's no evidence that we're making any progress in doing anything about terrorism. And in fact, just logically, it doesn't follow that the more we bomb, the more progress we make against terrorism. Terrorism is just not that kind of phenomenon. But no, if we were to continue in the path that we're going, we wouldn't be making more and more progress against terrorism. We'd be making less and less progress against terrorism, because we'd be multiplying the number of terrorists in the world by antagonizing more and more people in the countries that we are acting against or invading. So, no, I don't see any progress. I see an endless war, and a war that becomes more and more disastrous until, the reaction against the United States becomes an overwhelming one here and abroad. What do I think of the new nuclear policy? What do I think of the axis of evil? what can I say about the new nuclear policy? You know, nuclear bombs are good. I mean, it's, you know, they're, you know, this obviously is something absurd about the United States with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, talking about using it even more widely and cutting down on the possible restrictions on its use. I mean, you know, this is something that's frightening people in other countries, as it should, and it should be frightening people in our country. And I do feel that this administration, this government, when I talk about this administration, I'm including and condemning the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, because the Democratic Party has been so cowardly in its obsequious, agreement to everything that the government has done. But I do believe that by continuing their policies, by getting more and more stupid and repressive, that more and more people are going to wake up and become frightened by this evil empire that has been created in Washington. If any of you saw Michael Moore's film, what was it called? The Big One? The Big One. Michael Moore's film, not Roger, the Big One. Try to get hold of it. It's really the last line in The Big One is Michael Moore says, "Well, one evil empire down, one to go." Iraq. What is there to say about Iraq? I don't know if we're going to invade Iraq. I know lots of things, but I don't know if we're going to invade Iraq. I wouldn't put anything past this administration. You know, they're arrogant with power. They're puffed up with a sense of what they can do in the world. On the other hand, there has to be some recognition that they're not going to get much support elsewhere in the world with our bombing of Iraq, that they're going to more and more antagonize the countries in the Middle East, and the countries in Western Europe are not going along with us. And it may be seen more and more that an attack on Iraq is a way of diverting attention from the fact that we failed in Afghanistan. Our bombing failed to accomplish anything in Afghanistan, we'll bomb Iraq. When our bombing of Iraq fails, we'll go somewhere else. There's an infinite number of countries, right? Well, not an infinite, only 160 countries that we can go to and bomb. But, I don't know what will happen, but whatever happens, we have to do the same kind of things we do all the time, whatever happens. We don't predict in order to know what to do, we do in order to know what to predict. Yes. One more. Last question.
Okay.
People always assume that the person up here at the mic knows everything. And you're right. I will tell you. Question is, what can we do? Right? What can we do about all of this stupidity? Get involved. Get active. Find a group, right? As individuals, we don't have power. Find a group, even a small group of 5 or 10 or 15 people. Boston is full of groups doing good things. There are 100 organizations in Boston working on issues of peace and militarism and democracy and so on. Find one of those organizations, join it, and begin to do the little things which groups do against the current policy, and the little things which historically, when they are persisted in, they mount up and they mount up and they mount up and they spread around the country to the point where occasionally something good happens. So, thank you. Thanks for saving me.
Thank you so much for coming. Dates. as well as the South End Press titles Marx in Soho and the forthcoming book Emma on Emma Goldman. He's a tireless activist. If you've attended a teach-in, demonstration, or lecture about the war in the last few months, you may have been able to hear his humane and wise perspectives on the war. His forthcoming book, Terrorism and War, interviews with South End Press editor Anthony Arno, that's coming out, it's out this week actually. There's some really choice quotes and it's a wonderful collection of interviews. This is from the book. We have a long tradition in this country of stifling dissent exactly at those moments when dissent is badly needed, exactly when you need free speech, when the lives of the young people in the armed forces, the lives of people overseas who may be the victims of our armed actions are at stake. That's when you should shut up, exactly when you need it most. So you have free speech for trivia. Thanks for making it tonight. We know the weather's terrible and we really appreciate the effort in getting here. Welcome to the second lecture in the South End Press 25th Anniversary Lecture Series. Last week we were really happy to have Noam Chomsky speak here on Monday to a similarly packed house. And I want to tell you a little bit about South End Press before we get started. We've been passing out catalogs, so you might have a sense of who we are and what we publish. We're a homegrown institution, and we've been in the Boston area since 1977, first in the South End and now down the street in Central Square. And you can take a look at our catalog and see that we publish a really good collection of progressives, muckrakers, hellraisers of multiple stripes. And tonight we're very happy to welcome another local progressive to the stage, the activist and historian Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn is Professor Emeritus of History at Boston University. He's the author of the book People's History of the United States.
Let's see. How's this? Okay. Well, you just heard about South End Press. Maybe you already know about South End Press. Maybe that's why you're here, because you know about South End Press. But I need to say something about South End Press, or they won't let me go on with my speech. But South End Press has been around for 25 years, which is amazing. Not only has it been around for 25 years, but it has grown and increased its production and increased its readership. And it's amazing. Hardly anybody gave it a chance to survive, especially in a time when, as you know, the great monopoly publishers have been swallowing up all the little independent publishers. But South End Press has stuck it out.
Real issues and not for life and death issues, and that's called democracy. No, we can't accept that. And I'd like to bring Howard Zinn to the stage to talk a little bit more about what he's been talking about.
Thank you, Jill. Is this all right? A little louder. There's always discontent, malcontents in the audience. How's this? Better. But not really good. And has been producing some really remarkable books. So I hope you'll buy its books. You don't have to read them. Just buy them. And they're going to have books, right? Are there going to be books out back, right? You won't be able to get out of the church without passing very aggressive South End salespeople. So just one announcement to make, and that is Jill Stein is running for governor. Do you know that? Yeah. Some of you, well, some of you don't know that, I can tell. And Jill Stein is the Green Party candidate for governor. And she's the one person running for governor who has something really important to say